Have you ever watched someone fight to save a love that no longer remembered them? 3 days after asking his wife for a divorce, Rowan Mercer opened his eyes in a hospital bed, looked at the woman crying beside him, and asked the 4 words that shattered her heart all over again. Have we met before? At that moment, Rowan Mercer had no memory of asking for a divorce. He couldn't remember accusing his wife of destroying everything they had built together. He couldn't remember walking away from the only woman who had loved him long before success found him. But Sloane Mercer remembered every word, every accusation, every sleepless night, every signature waiting on a judge's desk. And the greatest heartbreak wasn't that her husband had forgotten why he wanted to leave her. It was discovering that the marriage hadn't been destroyed by the truth, but by a lie no one had questioned. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, if the person who broke your heart suddenly forgot everything, would you tell them the truth, or let them fall in love with you all over again? We'd love to read your answers. And if you enjoy emotional stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Then came the question no one in that hospital room was prepared to answer. Should Sloane tell Rowan that only 3 days earlier he had looked her in the eyes and said he wished he had never married her? Or should she allow him to meet her again as if fate had quietly offered them one final chance? What happened next would change not only their future, but uncover a secret buried years earlier that almost destroyed 2 innocent lives. Because sometimes the most painful memories are the ones we never should have believed. 5 years earlier, Rowan Mercer and Sloane Hayes never looked like the kind of couple destined for tragedy. They looked like the picture people secretly envied. Rowan was a self-made technology entrepreneur whose cybersecurity company had grown from a tiny rented office into one of Seattle's fastest-rising firms. At 38, magazines praised his discipline, investors admired his instincts, and employees respected the quiet confidence that made him seem larger than life without ever raising his voice. Sloane, a gifted architectural designer known for restoring historic buildings, possessed a calm strength that balanced Rowan's relentless ambition. She wasn't interested in red carpets or magazine covers. She cared about creating beautiful spaces where families could build lasting memories. Together they seemed unshakable, the kind of couple friends described with a smile and a touch of jealousy. They had weathered financial hardship together, celebrated impossible victories together, and promised each other that success would never matter more than the marriage they had fought so hard to build. Looking from the outside, there was no sign that everything they treasured was already beginning to crack beneath the surface. The change arrived so quietly that neither of them recognized it at first. Rowan's company secured the largest government contract of its history, bringing enormous wealth but demanding endless travel, late-night meetings, and constant pressure. Every decision suddenly carried millions of dollars in consequences. The man who once insisted on cooking breakfast every Sunday disappeared behind airport lounges, conference calls, and glowing laptop screens long after midnight. Sloane understood the demands of success and never complained. She left encouraging notes in his suitcase, surprised him with dinners that often grew cold before he returned home, and convinced herself that this exhausting season would eventually pass. Yet loneliness has a way of filling empty spaces with questions. Their conversations became shorter, their laughter became rare. They still loved each other deeply, but they were slowly living beside one another instead of with one another. Neither realized someone else had already noticed that growing distance, and was quietly preparing to use it for a purpose neither of them could imagine. Loneliness rarely arrives with a loud announcement. It settles quietly into ordinary routines until silence begins speaking louder than words. Rowan Mercer convinced himself that the distance between him and Sloane was temporary, something they would fix after one more business trip, one more investor meeting, one more demanding quarter. Sloane believed the same thing. She continued cheering for every milestone he achieved, proudly watching interviews where the world praised the man she had encouraged from the very beginning. But while she was protecting their marriage with patience, someone else was carefully dismantling it one piece at a time. The person behind it understood something dangerous about successful people. You don't always have to destroy their lives. Sometimes all you have to do is convince them that the person they trust most has already done it for you. That person was Vivian Cross, Rowan's newly appointed Chief Operations Officer. Intelligent, polished, and admired throughout the company, Vivian had earned everyone's confidence within months of joining the executive team. She anticipated Rowan's needs before he spoke them, organized impossible schedules with remarkable precision, and slowly became the employee he relied on more than anyone else. To outsiders, her loyalty appeared admirable. To Rowan, she was simply dependable during the busiest season of his career. But Vivian's admiration had crossed a line long before anyone noticed. She didn't just want Rowan's respect. She wanted the life Sloane was living. Every award he received, every article celebrating his success, every photograph showing Rowan smiling beside his wife deepened a quiet resentment she refused to acknowledge. In her mind, Sloane hadn't earned the future she was living. Vivian believed she deserved it more. She knew forcing Rowan to leave his wife would never work. He loved Sloane too deeply for that, so she chose something far more effective. She would convince him that Sloane had already betrayed him. It began with harmless observations slipped naturally into conversations. Vivian would casually mention seeing Sloane having coffee with an unfamiliar man downtown, presenting it as nothing more than coincidence. Weeks later, she remarked that she had noticed Sloane leaving an expensive hotel while attending a business luncheon nearby. She apologized each time, insisting she probably misunderstood what she saw. Rowan laughed the comments away, refusing to entertain the idea that his wife could ever be unfaithful. Yet once a seed of doubt is planted, the mind has an unsettling habit of watering it on its own. At the same time, Sloane found herself overwhelmed with a restoration project unlike anything she had handled before. An elderly client named Arthur Winslow had entrusted her with renovating a century-old family estate that held priceless sentimental value. Arthur's grandson, Declan Winslow, had recently returned from military service and worked closely with Sloane throughout the project, helping identify original architectural details and family artifacts hidden within the aging mansion. Their meetings became frequent, stretching into evenings whenever unexpected structural problems delayed construction. Sloane often returned home exhausted, carrying rolled blueprints instead of shopping bags, unaware that someone was photographing every interaction from a distance. Every handshake, every shared laugh after solving a design challenge, every late-night meeting became another carefully selected image, stripped entirely of its innocent context. Vivian never edited the truth. She rearranged it. Anonymous emails began arriving from untraceable addresses, containing photographs without explanations. Security footage mysteriously appeared showing Sloane entering hotels where construction investors happened to be meeting. Restaurant receipts found their way onto Rowan's desk, suggesting expensive dinners that were actually client consultations. Calendar screenshots appeared with names deliberately cropped, allowing ordinary work appointments to resemble secret rendezvous. None of the evidence was fabricated enough to invite immediate suspicion. It simply encouraged Rowan to reach devastating conclusions on his own. Every new discovery connected perfectly with the fear Vivian had quietly nurtured for months. Rowan tried desperately to ignore the growing uncertainty. He searched for reasonable explanations before confronting Sloane. More than once he picked up his phone intending to ask her directly, only to convince himself he first needed undeniable proof. Pride whispered that confronting her without certainty would make him appear insecure. Fear insisted the answers might confirm everything he dreaded. So instead of having the conversation that could have saved his marriage, Rowan withdrew further into silence. He watched Sloane through eyes clouded by suspicion, while she interpreted his distance as stress from work. The tragedy wasn't that they stopped loving each other. It was that they stopped sharing the fears only the other person could have erased. Sloane sensed something changing, even if she couldn't explain it. Rowan no longer kissed her goodbye before leaving for the office. Their evening conversations became polite rather than personal. Nights that once ended with dreams about their future ended with one of them pretending to be asleep while the other stared into the darkness, wondering what had gone wrong. She blamed herself, assuming she hadn't supported him enough during the busiest period of his career. She planned a weekend getaway to the quiet lakeside cabin where Rowan had proposed years earlier, hoping distance from work would help them find each other again. She never imagined he had already contacted a divorce attorney 2 days before she made the reservation. The confrontation finally arrived on a rain-soaked Thursday evening. Rowan walked into their home carrying a sealed envelope instead of flowers. His face held none of its familiar warmth. Sloane smiled, believing he had come home early because he missed her. She reached for a hug, but Rowan stepped back. The movement lasted barely a second, yet it felt as though the entire room had shifted beneath her feet. Without a word, he placed the envelope on the dining table. Sloane glanced at it before looking back into the eyes of the man she had loved for nearly a decade. The title on the first page stole the air from her lungs. Petition for dissolution of marriage. She searched his face, waiting for him to tell her it was some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, Rowan asked a question that shattered everything she thought he knew about her. How long has it been going on? His voice remained calm, almost exhausted, making the accusation hurt even more. Sloane stared at him in complete disbelief. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. Rowan removed several photographs from the envelope and spread them across the table. There was Sloane standing beside Declan at the construction site. Another showed them entering a hotel conference center for a meeting with investors. Another captured Declan placing his coat over Sloane's shoulders during an unexpected downpour outside the estate. To Rowan, they looked like pieces of a painful truth. To Sloane, they looked like ordinary moments, stolen from ordinary workdays. She tried explaining every photograph, every meeting, every conversation. She even offered to call Declan immediately and place the phone on speaker so Rowan could hear the truth himself. But once doubt hardens into certainty, explanations often sound like excuses. Rowan believed he had already uncovered the truth. He wasn't looking for answers anymore. He was looking for confirmation that his decision was justified. Every tear in Sloane's eyes only convinced him she had been caught. Every desperate explanation seemed rehearsed to a man whose judgment had already been clouded by months of calculated deception. When Sloane realized nothing she said could reach him, her voice became painfully quiet. "After everything we've survived together, you trust photographs more than you trust me?" Rowan lowered his eyes but didn't answer. His silence became the loudest response she had ever heard. Slowly, she picked up the divorce papers, folded them carefully, and placed them back inside the envelope. She wasn't accepting defeat. She simply understood that arguing with someone who no longer believed in her would only create deeper wounds. Before walking upstairs, she turned toward Rowan one final time. "One day," she said softly, "you're going to discover who really betrayed you. I only pray it doesn't happen after you've lost everything worth fighting for." Neither of them knew those would be the last words they exchanged as husband and wife before fate intervened in a way neither could have imagined. The following morning arrived with a silence neither Rowan nor Sloane had ever experienced. The house that had once echoed with laughter now felt unfamiliar, as though it belonged to strangers who had simply borrowed each other's memories. Sloane barely slept. She spent the night replaying every conversation from the past year, searching for the exact moment their marriage had begun slipping away. She wondered if she had missed warning signs or ignored cries for help hidden beneath Rowan's growing distance. Meanwhile, Rowan left the house before sunrise, carrying the signed divorce papers in a leather briefcase. His plan was simple: meet his attorney, file the documents, close the chapter that had consumed his thoughts for months. He believed he was doing the right thing, even though every mile he drove felt heavier than the last. Deep inside, a part of him wanted someone to stop him, someone to prove he was wrong. But pride is a powerful companion, and it kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel. As heavy rain covered the Seattle skyline, traffic slowed along the interstate. Rowan's phone buzzed repeatedly from the passenger seat. It was Vivian. She knew exactly where he was going, because she had personally arranged the meeting with the attorney weeks earlier. Rowan ignored the first call. Then the second. Finally, as the third call came through, he glanced down for only a moment. That single moment changed everything. A delivery truck several cars ahead lost control after hydroplaning across standing water. Vehicles collided one after another in a violent chain reaction. Rowan looked up just as brake lights exploded across the highway. He slammed the brakes and turned sharply, but there was nowhere to go. His SUV spun across the soaked pavement before crashing into the highway barrier with a force that sent glass and twisted metal flying through the rain. The world disappeared into darkness. Several hours later, Sloane's phone rang while she sat alone in her architecture studio pretending to work. The voice on the other end spoke calmly, but every word felt unreal. Rowan had survived. He was in critical condition, but expected to recover physically. Doctors needed immediate family at the hospital. Without hesitation, Sloane grabbed her keys and drove faster than she ever had in her life. It didn't matter that divorce papers were waiting to be filed. It didn't matter that he had accused her of destroying their marriage less than 24 hours earlier. The only thing that mattered was that the man she loved was still alive. She reached the intensive care unit with tears streaming down her face. Machines surrounded Rowan's bed, filling the room with quiet mechanical rhythms. His forehead was wrapped in bandages, bruises covered one side of his face, and his right arm rested in a sling. For the first time since their argument, anger disappeared completely. Looking at him lying there helpless reminded Sloane of the young man who once worked 3 jobs just to afford an engagement ring. She gently held his hand, whispered prayers through trembling lips, and remained beside him long after visiting hours had ended. Late that evening, Rowan slowly opened his eyes. His vision was blurry at first. Shapes slowly became faces. The doctors smiled with relief as they asked simple questions to evaluate his awareness. He remembered his own name. He remembered growing up in Oregon. He remembered building his company from the ground up. But when his eyes settled on Sloane, confusion replaced recognition. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Who are you?" The room fell completely still. Sloane felt the air leave her lungs. The doctor gently stepped forward and asked Rowan if he recognized the woman sitting beside him. Rowan studied her face carefully. There was something strangely comforting about her. Her eyes felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain. Looking at her somehow made the fear inside him disappear, yet no matter how hard he searched his memory, he couldn't place her. I feel like I should know you," he admitted softly. "Have we met before?" Sloane couldn't answer. One of the neurologists carefully explained that Rowan had suffered retrograde amnesia, affecting portions of his recent memory. Certain events from the past several years were fragmented or missing entirely. Some memories could return with time, others might never come back. Until they understood the extent of the injury, they advised everyone close to Rowan to avoid overwhelming him with emotionally traumatic information. That advice created an impossible decision. Should Sloane tell him she was his wife? Or should she tell him she was the woman he had planned to divorce? The doctors encouraged patience. Emotional shock, they warned, could interfere with recovery. For now, simple familiarity and calm surroundings were more important than difficult truths. Fighting back tears, Sloane introduced herself gently. "My name is Sloane." Rowan smiled. "It's nice to meet you." Sloane, those 5 words pierced her heart more deeply than the divorce papers ever had. Over the following days, Rowan's recovery surprised everyone. Physically, he improved quickly. He joked with nurses, thanked every staff member personally, and remained remarkably optimistic despite his injuries. Yet pieces of his recent life remained scattered like missing pages from a novel. He remembered founding Mercer Digital Solutions but couldn't remember most of the company's recent expansion. He remembered proposing to someone years ago but couldn't picture her face. Every attempt to recall the missing years ended with painful headaches. Sloane visited every afternoon. At first, she intended only to make sure he was comfortable, but something unexpected began happening. Rowan looked forward to her visits more than anyone else's. Whenever she entered the room, his entire expression changed. His shoulders relaxed, his smile appeared effortlessly. He found excuses to keep conversations going long after visiting hours should have ended. "What do you do?" he asked one afternoon. "I'm an architectural designer." His eyes brightened. "I knew there was something creative about you. You notice details everyone else misses." Sloane blinked in surprise. Years earlier, those exact words had been the first compliment Rowan ever gave her during their second date. He couldn't remember saying them, yet somehow, his heart still did. As weeks passed, their conversations became longer. They talked about childhood dreams, favorite books, embarrassing stories, and places they hoped to visit someday. Rowan laughed easily around her, often catching himself staring at her without realizing it. One evening, while watching the sunset through the hospital window, he quietly admitted something that left Sloane speechless. "I don't understand it," he said with a nervous smile. "I've only known you for a short time. At least I think I have. But whenever you're not here, it feels like something important is missing." Sloane turned toward the window so he wouldn't see the tears filling her eyes. The man who had believed she betrayed him, the man who had asked for a divorce, the man who couldn't even remember their marriage, was falling in love with her all over again. Neither of them realized that while hope was quietly returning to room 417, someone else was becoming increasingly desperate. Across town, Vivian Cross sat alone inside her office, staring at news reports about Rowan's recovery. The accident had ruined everything she had spent months carefully arranging. She had expected the divorce to be finalized before Rowan returned to work. Instead, he now remembered almost nothing about the accusations that had driven them apart. Worse still, hospital staff had mentioned that Sloane hadn't left his side since the accident. Vivian knew one terrifying truth. If Rowan's memories ever returned, so would the questions. And once those questions began, the carefully constructed lie that destroyed a marriage would begin collapsing piece by piece. 3 weeks after the accident, Rowan Mercer was discharged from the hospital. The doctors were encouraged by his physical recovery, but remained cautious about his memory. They explained that familiar surroundings could help reconnect forgotten experiences, though they warned everyone against forcing recollections. Stress, they said, could slow the healing process. Rowan nodded politely, but his attention stayed fixed on one person standing quietly near the doorway. Sloane smiled when he looked at her, though she carried the weight of a secret she never imagined she'd have to keep. She wasn't simply saying goodbye to a patient leaving the hospital. She was watching her own husband walk out of the building as if they had only recently become friends. Because Rowan had no close relatives living nearby, the doctors recommended someone stay with him for the first few weeks. Before anyone else could volunteer, Rowan looked directly at Sloane. "Would you mind helping me?" he asked, almost apologetically. "I know it's a lot to ask, but whenever you're around, everything feels calmer. I can't explain it." Sloane hesitated. Every part of her wanted to say yes. Every fearful part of her wondered if she was holding on to a marriage that no longer existed. After a long silence, she agreed, telling herself it was only until he regained his strength. Neither of them realized fate was quietly bringing them back into the same home they had nearly abandoned forever. Walking through the front door of the Mercer house felt strangely different for Rowan. Every room seemed familiar yet distant, like a place he had once seen in a dream. His eyes wandered across framed photographs lining the hallway. There they were, him and Sloane smiling beneath autumn trees, standing together on a sailboat, laughing with flour on their faces inside a kitchen. Rowan stopped in front of one wedding portrait. He studied it for nearly a minute before turning toward Sloane. "That's me," he whispered. She nodded gently. "And that's you." She nodded again. Rowan frowned, unable to understand why the image stirred something deep inside him without revealing the memory itself. "Were we close?" he asked. Sloane forced a small smile. "Once upon a time, very close." Over the following days, the house slowly came alive again. They shared breakfast each morning, often laughing over Rowan's failed attempts to make pancakes. He insisted on helping with dinner, despite forgetting where half the kitchen utensils were kept. They took evening walks through the neighborhood, where familiar streets awakened tiny flashes of recognition that disappeared almost as quickly as they arrived. Sometimes Rowan would suddenly stop walking, convinced he remembered something important, only for the memory to dissolve before he could grasp it. Each forgotten moment frustrated him, but Sloane never pressured him. She simply remained beside him, patient in ways that reminded Rowan why he felt so safe around her even without understanding why. One rainy afternoon, Rowan wandered into the attic searching for an old toolbox. Instead, he discovered dozens of cardboard boxes labeled in Sloane's neat handwriting. Curiosity got the better of him. Inside were ticket stubs from concerts, handwritten anniversary cards, vacation photographs, birthday decorations, and small souvenirs collected over years together. Every box told the story of two people who had built an extraordinary life from ordinary moments. Rowan sat on the attic floor for nearly an hour reading old letters. Although he couldn't remember writing many of them, every sentence sounded exactly like the man he believed himself to be. The affection was unmistakable. The promises felt genuine. The devotion poured from every page. One letter caught his attention more than the others. It had never been mailed. The envelope was addressed to Sloane but remained sealed. Rowan carefully opened it. The letter had been written almost 2 years earlier during one of his overseas business trips. "If success ever changes the way I look at you," he had written, "I hope you'll remind me of the young man who couldn't afford expensive dinners, but still believed he was the richest man alive because he had your love. Promise me we'll never become strangers living in the same house." Rowan lowered the letter slowly. A deep ache settled in his chest. "If I wrote this," he whispered to himself, "what happened to us?" That evening, he finally asked Sloane the question she had dreaded since the accident. "Were we happy?" She looked down at her untouched cup of tea before answering. "For a long time, yes." "And then?" Sloane's eyes filled with tears. Life became busy. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth. She still couldn't bring herself to tell him that he had accused her of betrayal, hired a lawyer, and placed divorce papers on the very table where they now sat sharing dinner. She wasn't protecting herself anymore. She was protecting the man struggling to rebuild pieces of a life he no longer remembered. Meanwhile, Vivian Cross watched everything unfold from a distance. Several executives had begun questioning unusual financial authorizations she had approved while Rowan was recovering. Nothing illegal had been discovered, but her behavior had changed. She became defensive during meetings, impatient with colleagues, and unusually interested in Rowan's medical updates. More troubling still, Rowan's longtime friend and chief financial officer, Grant Hollis, had quietly started reviewing company communications from the months leading up to the divorce. He wasn't searching for evidence of misconduct. He simply wanted to understand why Rowan's personality had changed so dramatically before the accident. Grant noticed something peculiar. Every anonymous email accusing Sloane of infidelity had arrived during periods when Vivian had access to Rowan's executive calendar. It was only a coincidence. At least, that's what it appeared to be. Then another discovery raised even more questions. Security logs showed someone inside the corporate office had repeatedly accessed Rowan's private cloud account late at night, using temporary administrator credentials. Those credentials had been issued only once. To Vivian, Grant leaned back in his chair. He still had no proof, only questions. But questions have a way of leading determined people toward uncomfortable answers. Across town, another unexpected clue was waiting. Declan Winslow, the man Rowan believed had been involved with Sloane, happened to visit her office regarding the completed restoration project. While discussing final paperwork, he mentioned something that instantly caught Sloane's attention. "I always wondered why someone kept taking pictures of us during those site visits," Declan said casually. "Remember that woman sitting in the black sedan outside the estate almost every week? She was there so often I assumed she worked for one of the investors." Sloane slowly looked up. "What woman?" Declan described her carefully. "Professional clothes, dark hair, elegant posture, always carrying a camera with a long lens, always leaving the moment he and Sloane finished talking." Sloane's heart began pounding. The description matched someone she knew all too well. For the first time since Rowan handed her the divorce papers, the impossible started feeling possible. What if those photographs hadn't been random at all? What if someone had followed them deliberately? What if every piece of evidence Rowan believed had been carefully placed in front of him? That night, Sloane drove home in complete silence. She walked into the house to find Rowan asleep on the living room couch with their old wedding album resting on his chest. One photograph had slipped onto the floor beside him. It showed the two of them dancing in their backyard on the night they bought their first home. Written across the bottom in Rowan's handwriting were 6 simple words: "You will always be my safest place." Sloane picked up the photograph and gently brushed a tear from her cheek. She had spent weeks wondering whether love alone could survive forgotten memories. Now a different question stood before her. If Rowan finally learned that he had asked for a divorce because of a lie, would he ever forgive himself? Or would the truth become even more painful than the memories he had lost? Sloane barely slept that night. Declan's words echoed through her mind over and over again. A woman in a black sedan, a camera with a long lens, appearing almost every week, leaving the moment each meeting ended. Until that conversation, she had convinced herself Rowan's accusations were born from stress and exhaustion. Now another possibility stood before her, one she had almost been too heartbroken to consider. What if someone hadn't merely taken advantage of their growing distance? What if someone had carefully engineered it? She quietly slipped out of bed before sunrise, determined not to let another day pass without searching for answers. She wasn't trying to save her marriage anymore. She wanted the truth, no matter where it led. Her first stop was the Winslow estate, where the restoration project had finally been completed. The property manager greeted her warmly and happily granted access to archived security footage stored on external drives. Most recordings had already been erased, but backup files covering the project's busiest months still existed. Hour after hour, Sloane watched grainy footage from parking lots, construction entrances, and surrounding streets. For a long time, nothing seemed unusual. Then, just after noon, she froze the video. Parked across the road was a black luxury sedan. The driver's side window lowered slightly. A woman stepped out carrying a professional camera. Although the footage wasn't perfectly clear, Sloane immediately recognized the tailored cream coat the woman often wore to company events. Vivian Cross. Her hands began shaking. She replayed the clip several times. There was no doubt. Vivian wasn't visiting the estate. She wasn't meeting clients. She wasn't inspecting construction. She was photographing Sloane. Every innocent conversation with Declan, every handshake, every business meeting, every ordinary moment, someone had been collecting pieces of her life like puzzle fragments, carefully selecting only the images capable of destroying a marriage. Sloane copied every available recording before leaving the estate. Across town, Rowan was experiencing a battle of his own. His recovery continued, but his memories refused to return in any predictable order. Instead, they arrived like brief flashes triggered by ordinary moments. The smell of cinnamon reminded him of Christmas mornings with Sloane. Hearing an old jazz song made him remember slow dancing in their kitchen. Passing a small bookstore awakened the memory of buying Sloane her favorite novel during their first anniversary. None of the memories lasted more than a few seconds, yet each one carried overwhelming emotion. They all shared one remarkable quality: every memory was happy. He couldn't remember a single moment that explained why he had ever wanted to lose the woman who filled every recovered memory with joy. That question became impossible to ignore. One evening, Rowan found Sloane sitting alone on the back porch, watching the rain fall across the garden they had planted together years earlier. He quietly joined her. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded. "If we were married," he began carefully, "why do I keep remembering us smiling?" Sloane remained silent. "I've searched every corner of my mind," Rowan continued. "I remember your laugh. I remember how safe I felt holding your hand. I remember teaching you how to sail even though you were terrified of the water. I remember promising we'd grow old together." He looked directly into her eyes. "But I can't remember falling out of love with you." Sloane finally broke. Tears rolled down her cheeks before she could stop them. "You didn't," she whispered. Rowan frowned. "What do you mean? You never stopped loving me." He stared at her in confusion. "Then why aren't we still together?" For several long seconds, Sloane couldn't speak. She had promised herself she would wait until the doctors believed Rowan was emotionally ready. But looking into his eyes, she realized the truth was already hurting him more than the secret. "You believed," she said softly, "that I betrayed you." Rowan's expression emptied completely. "What? You thought I was having an affair?" The words landed like stones. Rowan slowly stood. "No, you filed for divorce. No, you handed me the papers yourself." His breathing became uneven. "I would never." "You did." The room spun around him. His hands trembled as pieces of forgotten conversations flickered through his mind. Photographs, anonymous emails, late-night arguments. The dining room table, an envelope, Sloane crying. He grabbed the edge of the porch railing. "I remember," he whispered. Another flash. Vivian standing in his office. "I didn't want to tell you." Another flash. Photographs spread across his desk. "I thought I had proof." Another flash. Sloane asking him one heartbreaking question. "You trust photographs more than you trust me?" Rowan suddenly dropped to his knees. His memories hadn't fully returned, but that sentence did. Every word, exactly as she had spoken it. He covered his face with both hands as uncontrollable tears escaped. "Oh God." His voice cracked. "What have I done?" Sloane knelt beside him without saying a word. For nearly a minute, neither of them spoke. Finally, Rowan looked at her through tear-filled eyes. "Did you?" She answered without hesitation. "Never." Something inside Rowan shattered, not because she denied it, but because he believed her instantly, without photographs, without evidence, without explanations. He believed her because the man rediscovering his own heart finally recognized the woman sitting beside him. At that very moment, Grant Hollis was uncovering the final piece of the puzzle. Working late inside Mercer Digital Solutions, he managed to recover deleted files from the company's archived email server. Hidden inside temporary folders were original versions of the anonymous messages Rowan had received months earlier. The metadata revealed they had all originated from the same company network. One employee account, one administrator login, one office computer. Vivian Cross. Grant immediately contacted the company's cybersecurity team. Within hours, they recovered deleted browser history, encrypted cloud backups, and security camera access records. The evidence painted a devastating picture. Vivian had monitored Sloane's work schedule for months, tracked construction meetings, edited image timestamps, and anonymously delivered carefully selected photographs to Rowan while pretending to comfort him through his growing doubts. She hadn't invented the evidence. She had arranged it, manipulated it, presented it, until Rowan unknowingly destroyed the very marriage she wanted to replace. The following morning, Vivian arrived at headquarters expecting another ordinary workday. Instead, she found Grant waiting inside the executive conference room. Company attorneys stood beside him. Two detectives quietly entered moments later. Vivian stopped walking. The smile disappeared from her face. Grant placed a folder on the table. "You spent months convincing Rowan that his wife betrayed him." Vivian said nothing. "You thought deleting the files erased the truth." Still silence. Grant slowly slid several printed photographs across the table, then the recovered email records, then the security footage from the Winslow estate. Finally, the administrator login records bearing Vivian's name. For the first time since she entered the room, Vivian looked afraid. Meanwhile, completely unaware of what was unfolding downtown, Rowan stood inside the quiet chapel of the hospital where he had first awakened after the accident. Sloane found him sitting alone. He was holding two objects, their unsigned divorce papers, and their wedding photograph. Without looking up, Rowan spoke. "I almost traded forever." He swallowed hard. "For a lie." He folded the divorce papers one final time, Then, with trembling hands, he tore them slowly into dozens of tiny pieces. The pieces drifted onto the chapel floor like fallen leaves. Rowan turned toward Sloane. "I don't deserve another chance." His voice barely rose above a whisper, "but if there's even the smallest place left for me in your heart," he paused as tears filled his eyes, "would you let me spend the rest of my life earning back the love I was foolish enough to doubt?" Sloane looked at the man before her. Not the wealthy businessman, not the husband who accused her, not even the patient who forgot her. She saw the young man who once promised that no amount of success would ever matter more than the woman standing beside him. She stepped forward, took his hand. And for the first time since the day the divorce papers appeared on their dining room table, she smiled. But before either of them could speak another word, Rowan suddenly froze. A powerful memory surged through him, clearer than any before. He saw something he had never noticed the first time. The night Vivian had shown him the photographs, one image had been sitting on her desk before he even entered her office. She hadn't just received the evidence, she had been expecting it. Rowan slowly looked up. "I remember." His face turned pale. It was Vivian. Everything was finally coming back. And with every returning memory, the full weight of what he had almost lost became impossible to escape. The drive to Mercer Digital Solutions felt longer than it had ever been. Rowan sat in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel, as fragments of memory continued falling into place. Every passing mile uncovered another piece of the truth. He remembered Vivian insisting he deserved better. He remembered her carefully presenting anonymous emails as though she had reluctantly discovered them herself. He remembered how every conversation somehow ended with the same quiet suggestion that Sloane had changed. That success had made her look elsewhere. Looking back now, he could finally see what he had completely missed before. Vivian had never pushed him toward divorce. She had simply guided him toward believing it was his own idea. That realization hurt more than the betrayal itself. The person he blamed most wasn't Vivian. It was himself. No one had forced him to stop trusting his wife. He had made that choice. When Rowan entered the executive conference room, every conversation stopped. Vivian sat at the far end of the table with company attorneys beside her. Detectives quietly organized evidence across the polished wood surface. Grant looked up as Rowan walked in, saying nothing. There was nothing left to explain. The photographs were there, the recovered emails were there. Security logs, surveillance footage, and digital records connected every anonymous message to Vivian's office computer. Even the long-lens camera recovered from her apartment matched metadata found on hundreds of deleted photographs. Months of planning had finally collapsed under the weight of undeniable facts. Vivian looked at Rowan, hoping to find uncertainty in his eyes. Instead, she found something she had never expected. Disappointment, not anger, not revenge, just the sadness of a man realizing someone he trusted had chosen to destroy innocent lives. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Vivian lowered her eyes and let out a slow breath. "I never meant for it to become this big," she whispered. "I only wanted you to see what I believed was already true." Rowan's voice remained calm. "No," he replied. "You wanted me to stop believing the woman who never gave me a reason to doubt her." Vivian's composure finally broke. Tears filled her eyes, but they could no longer change what had already happened. The detectives escorted her from the room, leaving behind an empty chair that somehow represented years of pain. Outside the building, reporters gathered as news of the investigation began spreading across the city. Rowan ignored every question shouted in his direction. Cameras no longer mattered. Business headlines no longer mattered. Stock prices no longer mattered. There was only one place he wanted to be, one person he needed to see. As he drove away, another memory returned. He remembered the tiny bookstore where he had secretly bought Sloane a journal every anniversary. He smiled through tears, made a quick stop, and walked out carrying a brand new leather journal, with a simple silver inscription across the cover, "Our Second Beginning." Back at the house, Sloane was packing boxes. Not because she wanted to leave, because she believed it was finally time. She had promised herself that once Rowan learned the truth, she would give him complete freedom to decide what came next, without guilt or obligation. Their home echoed with quiet sounds as photographs disappeared into cartons, and books were placed on shelves marked for storage. She paused when she heard the front door open. Rowan walked in slowly, holding the journal in one hand and their wedding photograph in the other. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Rowan noticed the boxes. "You're leaving," Sloane nodded gently. "I thought, after everything, you deserved the chance to choose your future without feeling like you owed me anything." Rowan crossed the room until only a few steps separated them. My future? His voice trembled. My future has always been standing right in front of me. He carefully placed the journal on the dining table, the same table where the divorce papers had once rested. I spent weeks wondering why my heart trusted you before my memory did. He smiled sadly. Now I understand. He looked directly into her eyes. My memories forgot you. He placed a hand over his chest. But my heart never did. Sloane could no longer hold back the tears she had carried for months. Rowan reached into his jacket pocket and removed the final remaining copy of the divorce petition that had never been filed. Without taking his eyes off her, he tore it in half. Then again, and again. Tiny pieces floated onto the floor exactly where their marriage had nearly ended. This time there would be no signatures. No courthouse, no goodbye. Rowan slowly lowered himself onto one knee. Sloane's eyes widened. He reached into another pocket and revealed the engagement ring she had quietly removed after he asked for the divorce. Hospital staff had returned it with his personal belongings after the accident. He had carried it ever since. The first time I asked you to marry me, Rowan said softly, I promised to love you for the rest of my life. His voice cracked. The second time, he paused as tears rolled freely down his face. I'm asking for the chance to deserve you. He held out the ring. Sloane Mercer. He smiled through his tears. Will you marry me again? The silence that followed felt endless. Then Sloane laughed through her tears, the same warm laugh Rowan had remembered before anything else. She nodded. Yes, not because the past no longer hurt, but because forgiveness had become stronger than pain. Months later, family and close friends gathered in the small botanical garden where Rowan and Sloane had shared their first date nearly 10 years earlier. There were no reporters, no business partners, and no extravagant displays of wealth. Only flowers, quiet music, and people who genuinely loved them. Instead of repeating their original wedding vows, they wrote new ones. Rowan promised that trust would never again be replaced by assumptions. Sloane promised that honesty would remain louder than silence, even during life's hardest seasons. When they exchanged rings, the audience applauded, but neither of them noticed. They were too busy looking at each other with the kind of gratitude that only comes after almost losing everything. A year later, Mercer Digital Solutions launched a charitable foundation dedicated to helping families recover from trauma caused by false accusations, identity manipulation, and digital deception. Rowan often spoke at conferences, reminding audiences that technology could connect lives or destroy them depending on whose hands it served. Yet every speech ended with the same lesson. The greatest mistake I ever made wasn't believing a lie. He would pause and look toward the front row where Sloane always sat smiling. It was doubting the person who had already spent years proving she deserved my trust. As for Sloane, she never asked Rowan to erase the past. They kept one torn piece of the original divorce papers inside the leather journal titled Our Second Beginning. It wasn't there to remind them of heartbreak. It reminded them that love isn't measured by how perfect a marriage appears when everything is easy. It's measured by what two people choose to build after everything falls apart. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of Rowan and Sloane's story. He lost his memories. She almost lost her marriage. Together, they found something even more valuable than what they had before. Because sometimes life gives us only one chance at true love. And sometimes, if we're willing to forgive, it gives us the extraordinary gift of falling in love with the same person all over again. Before you go, we'd love to hear your thoughts. If you were in Sloane's position, would you have given Rowan a second chance after everything he put you through? Or would the pain have been too much to forgive? Let us know your answer in the comments below because every perspective tells a different story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another emotional journey filled with love, heartbreak, hope, and unforgettable endings. And if you know someone who believes in second chances, share this story with them today. You never know whose heart it might reach. Until next time, take care of the people who love you, protect the trust you've built, and remember, sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that find their way back home.